Hey everyone, tonight we're diving into the wild, jaw-dropping history of medieval popes, where divine authority often took detours through nepotism, bribery, and scandals so outrageous they'd make a soap opera blush. These weren't just spiritual leaders, some were power-hungry nobles, military strategists, or downright theatrical figures who happened to wear a mitre. Before you get too comfortable, hit that like button and subscribe if you're into this kind of storytelling. Drop a comment about where you're watching from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see our global audience tuning in. Now, dim those lights, maybe turn on a fan for some ambient noise, and let's unravel tonight's tale together. When people imagine the papacy, they picture a serene, white-robed figure offering blessings from a balcony. What they don't picture: a teenage nobleman gambling away church funds, or a pope so paranoid he built a moat around his palace. Welcome to the Middle Ages, where the papal throne wasn't just a seat of holiness, it was Europe's most contested power chair, second only to whichever throne France was currently fighting over. In theory, the pope was Christ's vicar, a humble man of prayer. In practice, the papacy functioned like a political trophy passed between ambitious families like a gilded hot potato, one that came with armies, land, and enough gold to fund a kingdom, or at least a few scandals. The chair of St. Peter wasn't just sacred, it was strategic. The Pope could crown emperors, excommunicate kings, and declare which side of a war had God's favor. That's immense pressure and immense temptation, especially when elections were rigged with bribes, favors, and a suspiciously enthusiastic cardinal or two. Many popes weren't theologians or saints, they were noble sons with no military prospects, funneled into the church as a backup career. Think, you're terrible with a sword, Benedict, but your Latin's decent. How about running Western Christendom? Once in power, some ruled like monarchs, waging wars, collecting taxes, and in some cases, living like Renaissance playboys with impeccable taste in robes. By the 10th and 11th centuries, papal elections had more intrigue than a Netflix drama. Take Pope John XII, crowned in 955 at 18 years old, not for his piety, but because his family owned Rome. He treated the papacy like his personal amusement park, gambling in the Lateran Palace, toasting pagan gods, and allegedly turning the papal residence into a brothel. He ordained a deacon in a stable, gouged out a critic's eyes, and raised, then lost, an army. His reign ended fittingly. He died mid-scandal, reportedly from a stroke while in bed with a married woman. Some said divine retribution, others suspected the husband. Either way, John XII didn't just embarrass the church, he redefined disgrace. Then came Benedict IX, the only pope to sell the papacy. He first took office at 20, with hobbies including orgies and wielding church authority like a child with a flamethrower. After being ousted, he returned twice, once to sell the throne to his godfather for gold, then to reclaim it when his marriage plans failed. The church, stuck with two popes, finally exiled him. Benedict proved the ultimate scandal wasn't lust or greed, it was treating the holiest office like a summer job. If you thought medieval popes kept their scandals confined to politics and power plays, brace yourself. We're now entering the Vatican's most salacious era, a whirlwind of romantic entanglements, jealous rivalries, and family dysfunction that would put modern reality TV to shame. This wasn't just holy office drama, it was the young and the restless with papal tiaras and more backstabbing. Take Benedict IX, the comeback king of papal chaos. Fresh off selling the papacy to his godfather, yes, literally, he abruptly tried to reclaim it, not out of spiritual calling, but because he'd fallen for a woman and thought resigning would impress her. Spoiler, it didn't. She rejected him, leaving Benedict humiliated, single, and scrambling to undo his godfather's papacy out of sheer spite. Romance and the papacy? A disastrous mix. But Benedict wasn't alone. Earlier, Pope Sergius III allegedly had a years-long affair with Marozia, a powerful Roman noblewoman. Their love child? None other than Pope John XI, yes, a pope who was the son of another pope, a theological paradox that should have come with its own excommunication bingo card. This era was so riddled with family schemes and bedroom politics that historians dubbed it the pornocracy rule of the harlots. Harsh? Maybe. But when cardinals, concubines, and cousins played musical chairs with the Holy See, the title fit. And just when you think it can't get weirder, enter the Cadaver Synod of 897, A moment so bizarre it feels like a deleted scene from Monty Python's Holy Grail. Pope Stephen VI, nursing a grudge against his predecessor, Pope Formosus, who'd been dead for a year, had the corpse exhumed, dressed in full papal regalia, and propped on a throne for trial. A deacon was appointed to defend the rotting corpse as Stephen hurled accusations, illegal election, violating canon law, basically being pope when I didn't like you. The verdict? Guilty. Formosus's papal robes were torn off, 3 fingers chopped, the ones used for blessings, and his body dumped into the Tiber River like cursed driftwood. Unsurprisingly, this didn't sit well with Rome. The spectacle sparked riots, finally, a line even medieval citizens wouldn't cross. Stephen was deposed, imprisoned, and strangled, while Formosus's remains were fished out and reburied with dignity. The cadaver synod became the ultimate metaphor for papal excess. When power goes unchecked, even the dead aren't safe. By the early 14th century, the papacy had reached peak dysfunction, so much so that the French crown essentially kidnapped the pope politely, of course. In 1309, Pope Clement V packed up the entire papal court and moved it from chaotic, riot-prone Rome to the sleepy, wine-soaked town of Avignon in southern France. Thus began the Avignon papacy, or as Romans bitterly called it, that time our pope ghosted us for 70 years. Officially, the move was about safety. Rome was dangerous. Murders, factional violence, and general Renaissance-era street drama were rampant. But conveniently, Avignon was under heavy French influence, and every single pope elected during this period just happened to be French. What an astonishing coincidence. The Avignon court quickly developed a reputation, not for piety, but for luxury. The papal palace resembled Versailles more than the Vatican, with banquets, silk tapestries, personal chefs, and wine cellars that could outrank a monastery. One pope reportedly spent more on spices than aid for the poor, because nothing says holy frugality like saffron-infused peacock roasts. Criticism poured in from across Christendom. Cardinals muttered about corruption, Italian nobles fumed. Pilgrims arriving at St. Peter's Basilica found empty windows and echoed, "Hello? Anyone home?" But the Avignon popes weren't in a hurry. Why return to Rome's chaos when Avignon offered better plumbing, fewer mobs, and actual cheese courses? Critics dubbed this era the Babylonian captivity of the Church, comparing the papacy's exile to Israel's biblical suffering. Harsh, but fair. When your holiest office operates out of a French wine region, people notice. Pressure finally forced Pope Gregory XI to return to Rome in 1377, but the respite lasted all of 5 minutes. When Gregory died, the Roman mob demanded an Italian pope, with torches for emphasis. The cardinals, many French, hastily elected Urban VI, an Italian. Problem solved? Not quite. Urban turned out to be difficult. He berated cardinals, refused compromise, and accused everyone of plots, which, to be fair, they eventually staged. Regretting their choice, the cardinals declared the election invalid, blaming mob pressure, and elected Clement VII instead, who set up shop back in Avignon. Thus began the Western Schism. 2 popes, each claiming legitimacy, each excommunicating the other with theatrical flair. France, Scotland, and Spain backed Avignon, England, and the Holy Roman Empire stuck with Rome. Bishops were confused, parishioners baffled, salvation became a matter of geographic loyalty. Then, in 1409, a council in Pisa tried to fix things by electing a 3rd pope. Now Christendom had a holy hat standoff, with all 3 men refusing to budge. The chaos finally ended in 1417 when the Council of Constance deposed all 3 and elected Martin V, who presumably prayed no one would start another schism before breakfast. The candlelight flickered erratically against the frescoed walls of the Lateran Palace as Rodrigo Borgia, soon to be Pope Alexander VI, surveyed the sea of crimson-clad cardinals before him. The year was 1492, the same year Columbus sailed the ocean blue. But all eyes in Rome were fixed on this far more terrestrial conquest, the papal election. The air hung thick with incense and ambition, every whispered negotiation carrying the weight of eternal souls and very temporal power. Rodrigo could almost taste the metallic tang of greed in the air as he watched his fellow cardinals' eyes dart between his lavish promises and their own salvation. "Let them weigh their souls against my gold," he mused, fingers tracing the emerald ring on his right hand. The bribery was spectacular even by Renaissance standards. Whole palaces exchanged hands, sacks of ducats discreetly passed under banquet tables, even rumors of a particularly enthusiastic cardinal receiving an entire vineyard. This wasn't an election, it was a holy fire sale, and Rodrigo was determined to outbid heaven itself. When the white smoke finally curled into the Roman sky, the new pope emerged not as a humble servant of God, but as the ultimate Renaissance predator, a man who'd treat the Vatican as equal parts mafia headquarters and family business. The moment the papal tiara touched his brow, Alexander VI's reign became a masterclass in shameless nepotism. His children, Cesare, Lucrezia, and others, were not hidden away as embarrassing secrets, but paraded as princes of the church. One could almost hear the collective gasp of Rome's pious elite when Cesare, barely 18 and already radiating dangerous charisma, was made a cardinal. The boy's crimson robes clashed horribly with his smirk, but then, subtlety was never the Borgia way. Late one evening in the Vatican's private chambers, Alexander leaned over a map of Italy, his shadow looming like a spider over its web. "The church is our birthright," he murmured to Cesare, watching with paternal pride as his son's fingers traced potential conquests. The flickering candlelight caught the cold calculation in the young cardinal's eyes. Here was a soul that had traded psalms for strategy before his voice even broke. Outside, a summer storm raged, the thunder drowning out the distant chants of Vespers. "Let them pray," Alexander thought, "while we rule." The Vatican's corridors soon buzzed with terrified whispers. Banquets became legendary, not for their piety but for their decadence. Masked balls where identities and morals blurred. Feasts where the wine flowed as freely as the rumors of what happened in shadowed alcoves. Servants spoke of strange noises from the apostolic palace after midnight, laughter too sharp, silences too heavy. And always the undercurrent of fear. The way courtiers' hands shook when accepting a goblet from Borgia retainers, the panicked glances at food tasters. Borgia poison wasn't just a metaphor, it was a dinner invitation. Enemies had a habit of developing sudden, fatal illnesses after sharing the Pope's table. Yet for all the scandal, Alexander VI was terrifyingly competent. He stabilized Vatican finances through creative taxation and outright extortion, fortified Rome's defenses, and played European monarchs against each other like a chess master. Even as his enemies choked their last curses, they had to admit, this was a pope who understood power. When Alexander finally died in 1503, likely from malaria, though poison and divine retirement were popular theories, Rome exhaled a breath it didn't know it was holding. The cobblestones seemed lighter without a shadow, but the legend remained, a pope who wore the sacred office like a battle cloak, who turned spirituality into a family enterprise, and who proved that in the right, or terribly wrong, hands, even St. Peter's keys could unlock a kingdom of sin. The Vatican's marble corridors echoed with the rhythmic clank of armor as Pope Julius II stormed through them, his scarlet robes billowing like a battle standard. It was 1503, and the newly elected pontiff carried himself less like a shepherd of souls and more like a general reviewing troops, which, in many ways, he was. The Swiss guards stiffened as he passed, their halberds glinting in the torchlight. Julius didn't just want to rule Christendom. He intended to conquer it back into existence. "Michelangelo will paint the ceiling," Julius declared to his startled advisors, slamming a gauntlet fist onto a table laden with battle maps. The sound made the wine goblets tremble. His mind's eye already saw the Sistine Chapel transformed, not as a place of quiet contemplation, but as a war banner in pigment and plaster, a declaration of papal might that would awe the masses. When the artist protested, Julius climbed the scaffolding himself, his armor scraping against the wooden planks. "Faster," he bellowed upward, oblivious to the paint dripping onto his mitre. Michelangelo, suspended upside down like some tormented angel, muttered curses that would have earned any other man excommunication. The warrior pope's daily routine defied all ecclesiastical decorum. Dawn found him reviewing troop deployments with his generals, noon in shouting matches with cardinals who flinched at his battlefront Latin, and dusk practicing swordsmanship in the Vatican gardens. The rhythmic clang of steel on steel mingled strangely with evening vespers. Servants whispered about finding bloodied practice swords leaning against confessionals, as if even the sacrament couldn't cleanse this pope's militant spirit. Yet for all his battlefield demeanor, Julius possessed an art collector's soul. His private chambers overflowed with classical statues, their marble limbs frozen in eternal struggle. Sometimes at night, when Rome slept, he'd run calloused fingers over a particularly fine Apollo, his face softening with something like regret. What might I have carved, he wondered, if destiny hadn't placed a sword in my hand? The moment always passed. By morning, he'd be back to dictating threats to Venetian diplomats, his voice hoarse from yelling at fresco painters. The contradictions defined him. He excommunicated enemies with the same fervor he commissioned Raphael's masterpieces. He waged war to reclaim papal lands while designing St. Peter's Basilica as Christianity's grandest monument. Even his death in 1513 came as an anticlimax, not in glorious battle as he might have wished, but Abed, surrounded by unfinished blueprints and the ghost of unconquered cities. As the last breath left his body, a strange quiet settled over Rome. The eternal city hadn't realized how accustomed it had grown to the constant din of his armored footsteps. The sin of crushed violets and melting wax hung heavy in the Vatican stanza della Segnatura as Pope Leo X reclined on a silk-draped divan, his jeweled fingers idly stroking the fur of his pet white elephant, Hanno. The year was 1513, and the first Medici Pope had transformed the Holy See into the most extravagant salon in Europe. Through the arched windows, golden afternoon light spilled across mosaics, gilding the bubbles in the champagne flutes carried by liveried servants. God gave us the papacy, let us enjoy it, Leo had famously declared upon his election. And enjoy it he did. A symphony of decadence played daily in Leo's court. At one end of the hall, poets recited verses so lush they made cardinals blush. At the other, exotic animals from the New World paced in gilded cages. The Pope's laughter, a rich, rolling sound that reminded one of coins cascading onto marble, would suddenly cease when his treasurer approached with ledgers. The figures made his plump fingers twitch. Julius Tuswars had drained the coffers, and Leo's artistic commissions weren't helping. Seldom heaven, he murmured one evening to his chamberlain, watching firelight dance across a newly arrived crate of Flemish tapestries. The solution emerged in parchment promises, indulgences that could shorten a soul's time in purgatory, for the right price. Soon, churchmen fanned across Europe like celestial salesmen, their velvet pouches jingling with coins. Peasants starved while parchment guarantees of salvation sold faster than hot bread at a Roman market. Leo barely noticed the discontent brewing in the north. When reports arrived about some German monk named Luther protesting the indulgence trade, he waved a languid hand heavy with rings. A drunken German, he chuckled to his dinner guests, will recant when sober. The roasted peacock on his plate seemed to stare at him with beady, knowing eyes as wine-stained lips curled in amusement. But the laughter died in his throat when Luther's 95 theses spread like wildfire. The Pope's usual repose fractured. Nervous fingers snapped at attendants for more wine, his once serene brow now furrowed. At night, the man who once slept soundly amidst menagerie noises now lay awake, haunted by visions of a fracturing church. The elephant Hanno, sensing his master's distress, would trumpet mournfully in the Vatican gardens, the sound echoing through corridors where anxious clerics whispered. Leo's end came not with a Reformation bang, but a gastronomic whimper, a surfeit of his beloved eel dishes in 1521. As he gasped his last breaths, the distant cheers of Luther's followers celebrating his excommunication drifted through the Roman streets like some grim counterpoint to the dying Pope's labored breathing. The Medici Pope who turned salvation into commerce had, in the end, underestimated the price of indulgence. The stench of rotting parchment and dried herbs assaulted the nostrils in Avicenna's dimly lit study, where the Persian polymaths had hunched over his latest manuscript. Moonlight bled through lattice windows, casting geometric shadows across the piles of scrolls that threatened to swallow the oil lamp's fragile glow. Ibn Sina's ink-stained fingers trembled slightly as he penned his magnum opus, the Canon of Medicine, a work that would dominate medical thought for centuries. Outside, the muezzin's pre-dawn call mingled strangely with the scratch of his quill, as if science and faith were dueling in the inkwell. Avicenna's mind was a living library, each diagnosis he'd ever made catalogued behind his weary eyes. He could still smell the gangrenous wound of that Bucharin Emir he'd treated last summer, cloves and cinnamon masking the decay as he'd prescribed maggots to clean the flesh. Now, dipping his pen again, he wrestled with Galen's errors. The great Roman never dissected a human corpse, he thought bitterly, watching a moth batter itself against his lamp. Yet we've taken his animal anatomies as gospel for a millennium. A sudden coughing fit doubled him over. The taste of blood, warm and metallic, startled him. Wiping his mouth with a sleeve already stiff with ink and sweat, he stared at the crimson smear. How ironic that the man writing the definitive medical text couldn't cure his own ailment. Somewhere in the palace gardens, nightingales sang as if mocking his mortality. Yet he pressed on. His chapters on quarantine procedures, written during the Baghdad plague, now seemed prophetic. The detailed drug compendium, where he'd risked his life testing mercury compounds, would save countless from syphilis centuries later. When he described disease spreading through tainted water, his quill hovered, as if sensing the germ theory he'd never lived to prove. Dawn found him slumped over vellum, his forehead resting on the dry ink of his final paragraph. The servant who discovered him thought at first the master was asleep, until he noticed the single drop of blood that had fallen precisely on the phrase, "the balance of humors." In death as in life, Avicenna's contradictions endured, a man chained to Galen's outdated theories yet whose clinical observations would light the way for modern medicine. The air in the operating theater at Epidaurus smelled of burning sage and nervous sweat as the supplicant, a fisherman from Corinth with hands still reeking of brine, lowered himself onto the sacred couch. Moonlight filtered through the linen curtains, painting his bandaged leg in silver and shadow. Around him, the rhythmic hiss of sacred snakes slithering across marble floors played counterpoint to his labored breathing. This was no ordinary hospital. This was the threshold between mortal suffering and divine intervention. "The god comes in dreams," the temple priest whispered, pressing a cold amulet to the fisherman's fevered brow. The man's fingers dug into the couch's leather straps, not because he feared pain, but because he feared hope. 20 years of dragging nets through the Aegean had ruined his knee, and the village physicians could only offer poppy tears and resignation. Now, lying in the abaton where thousands had slept before him, he fought the crushing weight of disappointment. What if Asclepius doesn't visit me? What if I'm not worthy? The priest extinguished the last oil lamp, plunging the chamber into a darkness so complete it seemed to swallow sound itself. Somewhere in the blackness, a snake brushed against the fisherman's bare foot, a sensation that should have terrified him, but instead sent a strange warmth radiating up his leg. As sleep claimed him, his final conscious thought was of his daughter's face, the way she pretended not to notice his limp when they walked to the docks at dawn. The dream came like a tide. A figure with a beard of living serpents stood at the foot of the couch. No, not stood, hovered, his staff glowing with an inner light that revealed the chamber's frescoes of miraculous healings. When the god's fingers touched the swollen knee, the fisherman gasped at the sudden absence of pain. But Asclepius shook his head, not yet, and pressed a golden cup to his lips. The liquid tasted of seawater and honey, of things lost and found. He awoke screaming as the joint snapped back into place with an audible crack. Priests came running with torches, their shadows leaping wildly across the walls. The fisherman's hands flew to his knee, where the bandages fell away to reveal nothing. No swelling, no disfigurement, just skin stretched taut over newly aligned bones. As dawn painted the sanctuary in rose gold, he walked to the votive wall. With trembling fingers, he added his clay model of a healed knee to the thousands already there. The offering slipped from his grasp, shattering at the foot of Asclepius' statue. The fisherman laughed through tears, understanding now why the god demanded broken things. Dawn's first light crept like a thief across the Tiber, revealing a macabre procession on the Ponte San Angelo. 12 gravediggers, their faces wrapped in vinegar-soaked cloth against the stench, shuffled under the weight of a makeshift bier carrying Pope Formosus' exhumed corpse. The dead pontiff's skeletal hands, still adorned with the fisherman's ring, clutched at empty air as if grasping for the justice death had denied him. At the bridge's midpoint, a gaunt figure in tattered papal vestments, Stephen VI, personal exorcist, began chanting the litany of the damned while sprinkling salt over the bloated remains. Inside the Lateran Basilica, the scene bordered on sacrilegious theater. Stephen VI had transformed the sacred space into a courtroom where the dead would stand trial. The cadaver, propped upright on the papal throne with decomposing flesh stuffed into its ceremonial robes, seemed to leer at the assembled clergy through empty eye sockets. A young deacon assigned as the corpse's defense counsel trembled so violently his scroll of arguments rattled like a snake's tail. How does the accused plead? Stephen's voice cracked with something between madness and triumph. A fly crawled from Formosa's nasal cavity, nature's own punctuation mark. The trial transcripts, preserved through some bureaucratic miracle, reveal Stephen's obsession, Formosa's supposed crime of becoming pope while previously serving as bishop of another see violated obscure canon law. But the subtext thundered louder than any charge. This was about vengeance, about Stephen's need to purge his predecessor's reforms. As witnesses testified against the mute defendant, wax dripped from suspended candles onto the marble floor, forming grotesque shapes that made altar boys cross themselves. When the verdict came guilty, naturally, Stephen personally ripped the pallium from the corpse's shoulders. The desecration escalated as 3 blessing fingers were hacked off with a butcher's cleaver, the brittle bones snapping like dry twigs. A German chronicler later wrote that the severed digits danced like Satan's puppets as they rolled across the altar steps. The final indignity came at dusk. As storm clouds gathered, the mutilated remains were hurled into the Tiber, only for fishermen to discover them weeks later tangled in nets, the waterlogged corpse miraculously upright in the reeds like some ghastly Baptist. The symbolism wasn't lost on Rome. Even the river rejected this injustice. Stephen's downfall came swiftly. The Romans, tolerant of nepotism and even murder, drew the line at necromantic jurisprudence. He was dragged from the Lateran by a mob of monks and merchants alike, his once fine vestments tearing like rotten parchment as they threw him into a dungeon cell. There, in the darkness where no trial would ever be held, someone slipped a noose around the corpse pope's neck and with one sharp tug, restored a modicum of sanity to Christendom. The Mediterranean sun beat down mercilessly on the deck of the Venetian galley as Lucrezia Borgia's entourage approached Ferrara. The 21-year-old stood motionless at the prow, her famously golden hair hidden beneath a widow's veil, her fingers tightening around the ship's rail until her ruby betrothal ring left crescent marks in her palm. Behind her, the Adriatic swallowed the last vestiges of Rome, and with it, the corpse of her second husband, Alfonso of Aragon, whose stabbed body had been dumped in the Tiber like so much Borgia collateral damage. This time, her father Pope Alexander VI had whispered at their farewell, pressing a jeweled vial into her hand, "You will be Duchess in truth, not just in name." The unspoken threat hung between them like the incense in St. Peter's. This third marriage to Ferrara's heir was the family's final gambit for legitimacy. The vial's contents, acquired from Cesare's personal alchemist, weighed heavy in her sleeve. Ferrara's wedding festivities unfolded like a grotesque parody of celebration. The Este family's courtiers eyed Lucrezia with barely concealed horror, their polite smiles not quite reaching their eyes. At the banquet, when her new husband Ercole too raised a toast, she noticed his hand trembled slightly, whether from nerves or the 6 food tasters who'd sampled every dish, she couldn't tell. The candied almonds turned ash in her mouth. That night in the bridal chamber, as servants discreetly collected the bedsheets for proof of virginity, a cruel joke given her 2 dead husbands, Lucrezia stared at her reflection in the polished silver mirror. The face staring back was a masterpiece of Borgia artifice, pearl-pale skin, lips stained with crushed cherries, eyes wide with calculated innocence. Only the slight tremor in her left eyelid betrayed the storm beneath. Somewhere beyond these walls, Cesare's agents were poisoning wells in Bologna to destabilize the region. Somewhere in Rome, her father was likely bedding another teenage mistress. And here she stood, the human chess piece in their game, breathing in the scent of orange blossoms from the wedding bouquet now wilting by the bed. Dawn found her still seated at the vanity, having poured the vial's contents out the window into the castle moat. The carp floating belly up by morning would be blamed on the summer heat. When Ercole awoke to find his bride demurely embroidering his coat of arms, he never noticed the broken blood blister under her fingernail where she'd tested the poison on herself first. The last light of the Renaissance was fading from the Vatican loggia when Pope Leo X collapsed onto his brocade cushions, his once ample frame now drowning in silken robes that smelled of medicinal eel grease and despair. Outside, the shouts of Luther's followers in Germany had become a dull roar even Rome couldn't ignore. The dying pope's fingers plucked uselessly at the golden threads in the fabric, as if he could unravel time itself back to those carefree days when the papacy was just one endless Medici soiree. Memories flickered behind his drooping eyelids like damaged frescoes. The deafening cheers when he'd ridden through Florence as a cardinal, tossing gold coins to the mob. The way Hanno the elephant used to trumpet joyfully at his approach, its trunk lifting him bodily onto its jeweled howdah. The particular shade of crimson in Raphael's school of Athens that always made his breath catch not from piety, but from sheer aesthetic rapture. A sudden spasm racked his body, sending a half-empty wine goblet crashing to the marble floor. The sound echoed through the cavernous chamber where not a single courtier remained. Even his beloved poets had fled when the coughing fits turned bloody. Only the crucifix above his bed kept watch, its bronze Christ seeming to lean forward in judgment. Somewhere beyond the Alps, woodcuts were rolling off presses showing the whore of Babylon wearing his distinctive triple crown. The irony wasn't lost on Leo. He who had commissioned the most beautiful art of the age would be immortalized in crude Protestant propaganda. His final coherent thought was of Luther's damned theses burning in the Piazza San Pietro, and how the flames had smelled suspiciously like the indulgence parchments he'd sold by the thousands. When the chamberlain returned at dawn, he found the Pope stiffening in a grotesque parody of repose, his mouth frozen in what might have been a smile or a grimace. The ring still glittered on his fingers, but the famous emerald, pawned months ago to pay mercenaries, left a telling pale band on his flesh. Outside, the bells of St. Peter's began tolling, their somber notes blending with the raucous cries of fishmongers in the Campo da Fiori. Rome would mourn, but life, crass, vibrant, and utterly indifferent, went on. And in a Wittenberg church, a certain excommunicated monk was already drafting his next pamphlet. The scent of burning sage and nervous sweat clung to the marble halls of the Asclepian at Epidaurus as the blind woman from Thebes was led to the sacred dormitory. Her fingers trembled against the priest's arm, each hesitant step echoing through the colonnade where hundreds of votive offerings, clay eyes, ears, and limbs hung like a grotesque harvest of human hope. The evening breeze carried whispers from the nearby theater, where actors rehearsed a comedy about mistaken identities, a cruel irony for one who hadn't seen her own face in 15 years. "The God comes to those who believe," the priest murmured, guiding her to the recline where countless supplicants had slept before. The linen sheets smelled of lavender and old dreams. As she lay down, her milky eyes reflected the flickering oil lamps like dull moons. Somewhere in the darkness, the sacred snakes slithered across the floor, their scales whispering against stone. The woman flinched when one brushed her bare foot, not from fear, but from the startling memory of texture. Sleep came like a warm tide, pulling her under into visions of her youth. Suddenly, a presence filled the dream, a bearded figure whose staff pulsed with golden light. When his fingers touched her eyelids, the world exploded in colors she'd forgotten. The deep azure of summer skies, the fiery crimson of pomegranate seeds, the rich ochre of her daughter's hair. "Open," the god commanded. She awoke screaming as dawn's first light pierced her pupils, her seeing pupils for the first time in decades. Priests came running, their faces a blur of astonishment. The world rushed in with unbearable brightness, the vermilion stripes on their robes, the green patina of the bronze Asclepius statue, the dust motes dancing in sunbeams. Overwhelmed, she collapsed to her knees, her hands scrambling for the clay eyes she'd brought as offering. They shattered against the marble floor, their fragments mixing with her tears. Outside, the morning market vendors paused as the once blind woman staggered into the sunlight, her hands outstretched as if to catch the very colors of the world. A potter dropped his wares when she called him by name, recognizing him from his voice alone after 20 years of darkness. By noon, pilgrims were already carving new votives, not eyes this time, but open hands cupping light. That evening in the theater, as actors performed Oedipus Rex, no one noticed the woman in the front row who wept continuously, not at the tragedy, but at the miraculous mundanity of being able to see the actors' painted masks. The stench of rotting fish and damp filled the cramped Venetian counting house where a young Luca Pacioli hunched over his ledger, his ink-stained fingers tracing columns of numbers by flickering candlelight. Outside, winter waves lashed against the docks where galley slaves unloaded bolts of Persian silk and sacks of Indian pepper, the sense of empire that would one day fuel his revolutionary calculations. A drop of sweat fell from his brow onto the parchment, blurring a record of unpaid debts. "There must be a better way," Luca muttered, rubbing his tired eyes. The candle's flame reflected in his pupils like twin abacuses, each flicker illuminating his growing realization. The chaotic jumble of Roman numerals couldn't capture the commercial explosion happening around him. Somewhere in the dark canals outside, a ship's captain was cheating a merchant, a banker was falsifying records, and all because mathematics remained trapped in antiquity. His breakthrough came at dawn after a sleepless night. When the first gondolier's cries echoed across the Grand Canal, Luca was already scribbling furiously, not with Roman X's and V's, but with strange new symbols borrowed from Arab traders. 1, 2, 3. The numbers flowed like music, allowing calculations his abacus couldn't match. He laughed aloud when he balanced his first double-entry ledger, the columns lining up with satisfying precision. The numbers sang to him, revealing patterns and truths hidden for centuries. Years later in Milan, when he presented his Summa de Arithmetica to Ludovico Sforza's court, Leonardo da Vinci, seated nearby, leaned forward with sudden interest. The artist's sharp eyes darted across Luca's diagrams, recognizing in these Arabic numerals the same elegant efficiency he sought in his machines. Their subsequent collaboration would birth drawings of gear ratios and hydraulic pumps rendered with mathematical precision, the blueprints of the Renaissance. But on this winter night in Venice, young Luca simply blew out his candle and inhaled the salty air of change. Somewhere beyond the lagoon, the old medieval order was crumbling, and he, a friar's son with ink under his nails, held the tools to rebuild it in numbers. The roar of the Tiber in flood season drowned the gasps of the crowd as the papal guards dragged Giordano Bruno across the Ponte Sant'Angelo, his bare feet leaving smears of blood on the damp cobblestones. The year was 1600, and Rome had saved its most theatrical punishment for this philosopher who dared to dream of infinite worlds. Through swollen eyelids, Bruno watched sunlight glint off the bronze angels overhead, their faces frozen in perpetual judgment, much like the cardinals who had condemned him. A woman in the crowd pressed a handkerchief to her nose, not against the stench of the chained prisoner, but to block the odor of burning flesh already wafting from Campo da Fiori. The execution pyre stood ready, its stacked kindling arranged with almost ritual precision. Bruno's lips moved silently, rehearsing arguments no one would hear over the crackling flames. His heresies whispered through his broken teeth, stars as distant suns, worlds beyond count, a universe with no center, ideas more dangerous to the church than any Lutheran revolt. As the guards stripped him naked, a curious hush fell. The executioner hesitated when he saw Bruno's back, not because of the whip marks, but because the philosopher had carved Copernican diagrams into his own flesh during imprisonment, the healed scars forming a celestial map. For one breathless moment, even the jeering mob fell silent before this living atlas of forbidden knowledge. The first tongues of fire licked at his feet when Bruno finally spoke aloud. Perhaps you tremble more in pronouncing this sentence than I do in hearing it. The wood smoke curled around his words, carrying them up past the watching cardinal's balcony where Galileo Galilei, then a young mathematician visiting Rome, stood gripping the railing until his knuckles whitened. By nightfall, when the ashes cooled, street sweepers found Bruno's heart miraculously intact amidst the embers, a final defiance against the finite world his executioners believed in. Some apprentice from the print shops would later slip the charred organ into a pamphlet casing, creating an accidental reliquary for the man who saw infinity. And high above, the stars Bruno had charted burned on, indifferent to the petty dramas of earthbound men. The Globe Theatre's thatch roof trembled under a sudden gust as Will Shakespeare snatched the quill from his ear, its nib splitting under the pressure of his grip. Backstage, the scent of bear grease and cheap perfume clung to the actors donning their costumes for Henry V, but the playwright saw only the blank parchment accusing him from the table. The words had abandoned him tonight, ever since the news from Stratford. His son Hamnet, barely 11 summers old, lay cold in the churchyard. A moth battered itself against his oil lamp, its wings making faint parchment rustling sounds against the glass. Will stared at the creature's desperate dance, remembering how Hamnet used to chase butterflies through the Avon meadows, their colors vanishing into his small hands like lost lines of poetry. Now his quill hovered over the page, dripping ink like a wound that wouldn't close. "What's in a name?" he wrote suddenly, then scratched it out violently. Too raw. Too close. The candle guttered as a draft swept through the tiring house, carrying snippets of the chamberlain's men rehearsing the St. Crispin's Day speech. "We few, we happy few." The irony choked him. What comfort was there in Band of Brothers when his own bloodline had snapped like a lute string? Then, as dawn's first light crept through the cracks in the wooden walls, Will's quill found its rhythm again. Not history this time, but something new, a prince of Denmark brooding in black silk, a ghost walking the battlements, a vial of poison in a maiden's ear. The words flowed now like the Avon in flood season, carrying fragments of his grief, Yorick's skull cradled like a child's head, Ophelia's waterlogged skirts blooming in the current, a queen's agonized cry over her dead son. When Richard Burbage burst in hours later, he found while asleep atop the manuscript, his cheek pressed to the still damp ink where he'd written, "Good night, sweet prince, and flights of angels sing thee to thy rest." The actor's calloused fingers trembled as he lifted the page, recognizing in these lines something far more dangerous than any history play. The alchemy of personal sorrow transformed into universal truth. Outside, the morning bells of St. Mary Overies rang across the Thames, their notes skipping over the water like flatstones. London awoke unaware that its greatest tragedy had just been born from a father's broken heart. The scent of molten lead and burning parchment filled the Sistine Chapel as Michelangelo lay on his back atop the scaffolding, his beard stiff with dried paint and his spine screaming in protest. 60 feet below, Pope Julius II's impatient footsteps echoed like distant thunder. The warrior pope had come to check on his ceiling again. A glob of crimson paint dripped from the brush, splattering onto the artist's forehead like a stigmata of artistic torment. "When will you make an end of it?" Julius bellowed upward, his voice ricocheting off the half-finished images of prophets and sibyls. Michelangelo bit back a curse, tasting the bitter tang of pigments on his tongue. For 3 years he'd endured this inverted torture, neck permanently craned, paint dripping into his eyes, plaster hardening too fast in the Roman heat. His fingers, once sculpted to shape marble with divine precision, now cramped around brushes like an old man's. A sudden memory surfaced, his boyhood in the Medici Gardens, carefully dissecting corpses by moonlight to understand muscle and bone. How simple those stolen cadavers seemed compared to this living nightmare of bringing Genesis to life above his head. The creation of Adam hovered just beyond reach, God's outstretched finger eternally suspended inches from man's. Just like my own damned pay, he thought bitterly, wiping sweat from his eyes with a paint-stained rag. Julius's armored silhouette paced beneath the scaffolding like a caged lion. Michelangelo could picture the papal scowl, those bushy eyebrows drawn together, the ruby ring tapping impatiently against his sword hilt. The artist dipped his brush in ochre and, with deliberate slowness, added another fold to Jeremiah's cloak. Let the old warmonger wait. Then, inspiration struck like lightning. His charcoal flew across the fresh plaster, sketching a new figure in the corner of the Last Judgment panel he wasn't even supposed to start yet, a flayed man holding his own skin, the face unmistakably Michelangelo's own tortured features. A private joke for future generations to find. The Pope would never notice, not with his failing eyesight. As Julius stormed out with threats to topple the scaffolding, Michelangelo allowed himself a grim smile. Up here in his aerial prison, suspended between heaven and earth, he was finally free to create his own version of divinity, one agonizing brushstroke at a time. The pre-dawn mist clung to the canals like a guilty secret as Antonio Vivaldi shuffled across the Piaduesque courtyard, his violin case knocking against his arthritic knees. Inside the Ospedale della Pieta, the faint scent of beeswax and girlhood still lingered in the rehearsal room, though its most famous resident composer hadn't set foot here in years. The red priest's once fiery hair had faded to the color of old parchment, matching the yellowed scores piled haphazardly on the forte piano. A discordant note rang out as he dropped his cane. The girls, his figli di caro, should have been stirring by now, their slippered feet padding down dormitory corridors, their angelic voices warming up for morning mass. But the music school stood silent save for the scuttling of mice in the rafters. Venice had moved on from his Four Seasons, just as it had from his scarlet-haired brilliance. His gnarled fingers traced the violin's curves with the tenderness of a lover. This instrument knew his truths, how he composed concertos at lightning speed between masses, how he'd smuggled operatic passion into sacred music, how the orphan girls under his tutelage had played with a fire that made cardinals blush. Now the same fingers stumbled through a G minor passage from Winter, the notes fracturing like icicles falling from church eaves. A sudden cough racked his thin frame, leaving coppery blood on his palm. Outside, gondoliers began their morning cries, the same rhythms that had infused his concertos decades ago. Vivaldi chuckled darkly, imagining his funeral. No grand procession at St. Mark's, just some pauper's grave in Vienna where he'd gone chasing one last commission. The thought loosened something in his chest. With sudden clarity, he grabbed a quill and began scribbling on the back of an old grocery list, not the pious counterpoint expected of a priest, but wild, untamed music that would make his girls gasp. Let them say he died penniless and forgotten. This final composition would be his confession. As dawn's light finally pierced the fog, illuminating the dust motes above his piano, the old fire returned to his eyes. The Red Priest had one last sermon to give. The smell of turpentine and rotting apples filled Rembrandt's Amsterdam studio as the aging master squinted at his latest self-portrait, the face staring back from the canvas far older than the one in the shaving mirror. Winter light bled through the cracked window, illuminating the piles of unsold paintings leaning against the walls like disappointed creditors. His fingers, once the toast of Dutch aristocracy, now trembled as they mixed another batch of ochre, the pigment gritty with sand he'd added to stretch his dwindling supplies. A sudden commotion erupted downstairs. Saskia's pearl necklace, his last treasure from their married days, was being carried away by the bailiff's men. The clatter of their boots on the stairs sent a tremor through his bad leg, making him smear Titus' eyebrow in the family portrait he'd been retouching. No matter, he thought bitterly. The boy's face already resembled his dead mother more with each passing year. Outside, the Herrengracht canal reflected a city that had moved on, younger artists painting brighter, happier scenes for merchants who wanted their vanity immortalized in flattering light. Rembrandt's reflection in the window superimposed itself over this bustling world, a grizzled ghost with paint-stained smock, his famous beret now moth-eaten at the edges. He turned back to the self-portrait, loading his brush with raw umber. The face emerging wasn't the proud genius of his youth, but something far more interesting, a network of crevices and shadows, each wrinkle a road map of bad decisions and hard-won wisdom. The eyes still burned with the same fire that had once seen through layers of human pretense to the fragile souls beneath. A knock startled him. The baker's daughter stood holding a loaf in lieu of payment for last week's drawing lessons. As she left, Rembrandt absent-mindedly rubbed breadcrumbs between his fingers, the same gesture he'd used to test parchment quality in Leiden as a student. The irony wasn't lost on him. The painter who once commanded 1,000 guilder commissions now bartering for bread. Dusk found him still working, the portrait now alive with something beyond realism, a raw honesty that would make his patron squirm. The last light caught his palette knife as he scraped away a highlight on the forehead, revealing the rough underpainting beneath. Perfection was for the young. At 63, he finally understood true mastery lay in showing the cracks. The scent of molten wax and burning tallow filled Westminster Hall as the executioner's axe flashed in the gray January light. Charles I stood motionless on the scaffold, his shoulders squared beneath the thin white shirt he'd insisted on wearing, no royal robes to stain with his blood. The winter air carried whispers from the crowd, a sea of faces both eager and terrified to witness divinity unmade. A woman fainted as the king knelt, her collapse sending ripples through the mob like wind through wheat. "Remember," Charles murmured to Bishop Juxon, his breath fogging in the cold. The word hung between them, heavy with unspoken meaning. Was it a plea? A warning? Or some final chess move in the political game that had cost him his crown? The bishop's trembling hands clutched the silver crucifix so tightly its edges bit into his palm. As the king stretched his neck across the block, an extraordinary thing happened. The crowd's murmuring ceased. Even the ravens in the rafters stilled their cries. For one suspended moment, England held its breath. Then the axe fell with a wet thud, its blade biting through flesh and bone with terrible efficiency. The head rolled slightly, coming to rest with Charles's eyes still open, staring toward Whitehall where his art collection, those Rubenses and Van Dycks he loved more than his people, would soon be scattered by Cromwell's men. A strange sound bubbled up from the spectators, not cheers, not weeping, but something more primal, the collective gasp of a nation realizing it had crossed a threshold from which there could be no return. Soldiers rushed to dip their handkerchiefs in royal blood, believing it held curative powers even as it seeped between the scaffold's cracks. That evening, as snow began dusting London's rooftops, a young John Milton stood at his window watching the flakes obscure the bloodstains in the square below. His fingers itched for a pen. Somewhere in the silence, the first seeds of paradise lost took root, not in triumph, but in the terrible understanding that even fallen kings cast long shadows. The scent of gunpowder and what will clung to the trenches as Wilfred Owen scribbled his poem by the flickering light of a dying flare. Somewhere in no man's land, a wounded horse screamed, a sound that always made the young poet's hands tremble more than artillery fire. His pencil moved frantically across the damp paper, chasing the words before they vanished like the faces of his dead comrades in last week's charge. "What passing bells for these who die as cattle," he wrote, then scratched out "cattle," too obvious. The real horror wasn't the slaughter, but the bureaucracy of it. The neatly typed casualty lists, the precision timetables for bombardments, the way the general's polished boots never touched the mud where men drowned in shell holes. A rat scurried over his boot, its eyes reflecting the flare's eerie glow. Owen froze, remembering his lieutenant's face when gangrene set in, the same glassy stare as the scavenger. His poem took a sudden turn, the lines now twisting like barbed wire across the page. The words came faster now, ugly and beautiful in their truth. The boy who choked on mustard gas, the way his own voice had cracked reading Whitman to the troops, the letters from home that still began, "When you returned." Dawn found him still writing, his uniform stiff with frost. The morning barrage would begin soon, but for now there was only this fragile moment between darkness and death, where poetry could still make the unbearable visible. When the shelling started, Owen tucked the finished poem inside his gas mask case, a slim hope that if his body was recovered, someone might understand what they'd all become in this war. The paper absorbed the dampness of his breath, the words blurring slightly at the edges like the world itself. The stench of formaldehyde and rotting lilies choked the Paris morgue as Marie Curie bent over the autopsy table, her radium-scarred fingers adjusting the Geiger counter over the physicist's corpse. The year was 1934, and the woman who'd unlocked the secrets of the atom now faced a mystery even science couldn't explain, her own body failing in ways that mirrored this cadaver before her. The counter's clicks accelerated near the man's fingertips, still faintly radioactive from handling polonium samples. "Like recognizes like," she murmured in Polish, the language of her childhood resurfacing through the morphine fog. The morgue attendant shifted uncomfortably. Everyone knew the madam's laboratory notebooks required lead-lined boxes now. Even her cookbook at home made Geiger counters sing. A sudden wave of nausea forced her to clutch the table's edge. Through the high windows, Parisian sunlight illuminated the dust motes swirling around her, each speck potentially carrying the very particles that were killing her. The irony didn't escape Marie. The same cosmic rays she'd once chased through thunderstorms with electroscopes now danced invisibly through her marrow. Her daughter Arin's voice echoed down the tiled corridor, sharp with concern, just like Pierre's used to be before the carriage accident. Marie quickly straightened her spine. There were still measurements to record, papers to review. With trembling hands, she flipped open the dead man's file and froze. The symptoms stared back at her in clinical French: aplastic anemia, necrotic tissue, spontaneous hemorrhaging, a perfect mirror of her own medical chart upstairs. The Geiger counter's steady clicks seemed to mock her. Somewhere in this sterile room, between the stainless steel instruments and the corpse's waxy skin, Marie Curie finally understood the terrible truth she'd been avoiding. The glowing element she'd cradled like a child in her Becquerel electrometer had been a Trojan gift. Its brilliance came at the cost of devouring its discoverer from within. As Arin burst in with fresh X-rays, Marie caught her reflection in the morgue's glass cabinet. The face staring back was already half-ghost, illuminated not by laboratory triumph now, but by the eerie blue glow of her own mortality. The metallic tang of blood and antiseptic filled the makeshift hospital tent as Norman Bethune pressed his forehead against the icy transfusion bottle, watching his own blood snake through the rubber tube toward the wounded soldier's arm. Outside, Japanese artillery painted the Hubei mountainside with explosions, each blast making the lantern light tremble across the peasant boy's ashen face. The boy couldn't have been more than 16, same age as the Canadian volunteers Bethune had treated in Spain. "Damn it, stay with me," he barked in a mix of broken Mandarin and English, his scalpel flashing as he reopened a clotted chest wound. The patient's pulse fluttered like a dying bird under his fingertips. Somewhere in the tent, a radio crackled with news of fascist advances, Madrid, then Nanjing, now this nameless village. The war was eating the world one young life at a time. A memory surfaced, His Montreal apartment the night he'd left for China, the way moonlight had glinted off his unused surgical awards as he packed his transfusion kits. The Canadian Medical Association had called him a traitor for serving communist causes. Now, kneeling in frozen mud with his bare hands deep in a stranger's chest, Bethune understood true treason was standing idle while the world burned. The soldier's eyes suddenly focused, not with pain, but recognition. His chapped lips formed two syllables, by Cho-In, Bethune's Chinese name. In that moment, the blood connection between them became more than physiological. The lantern flickered as the boy's hand found Bethune's sleeve, leaving a smeared red print on the already stained wool. Dawn found Bethune still operating, his left boot squelching with blood that had seeped through the floorboards. When the last transfusion bottle emptied, he didn't hesitate, just jabbed the needle into his own arm again. The Chinese orderly gasped, but Bethune silenced him with a glare. What were a few more pints when millions were dying? Outside, the artillery paused. In that fragile silence, the drip-drip of his blood into the next soldier's veins became the only clock that mattered. The scent of burning parchment and aged incense still clung to the Vatican secret archives when Dr. Valenti's gloved fingers brushed against the 15th century ledger marked Borgia, Materia Medica. The modern Geiger counter beside her emitted an erratic click, impossible for paper this old. As she carefully unfolded the vellum, flakes of crimson pigment drifted down like dried blood, revealing Rodrigo Borgia's personal recipes for gout, for French pox, for enemies. Her breath caught at the final entry. Aqua Tofana, 3 drops in wine for a merciful end. The exact same arsenic compound now sitting in her lab's cancer research freezer, derived from mineral deposits near Avignon. Science had come full circle. What Renaissance popes used as a weapon, 21st century oncologists were testing as targeted therapy. The irony stung. Alexander VI's personal poison might soon extend lives instead of ending them. Suddenly, the archive's motion-activated lights flickered off, plunging her into darkness. In that black moment, centuries collapsed. She could almost hear the rustle of Borgia robes, the whisper of a papal physician grinding minerals with a mortar and pestle. When the lights buzzed back on, her smartphone glowed with a colleague's message, trial approved. Begin Phase 2 testing. Outside in St. Peter's Square, tourists snapped photos of the Egyptian obelisk that had witnessed the Renaissance's worst atrocities. Dr. Valenti tucked the ledger into its protective case, her fingers lingering on the family crest, the same bull symbol now etched onto her clinical trial vials. History's darkest alchemy was being redeemed, one molecular bond at a time. The morning sun filtered through bulletproof glass into the Sistine Chapel, where 12 white-coated figures stood beneath Michelangelo's Last Judgment. Their lanyards identified them as oncologists from Jerusalem to Hiroshima, gathered for an unprecedented conference on ethical radiotherapy. Dr. Valenti's presentation slides cast blue light across the fresco's flayed skin, the very self-portrait the artist had hidden in his 16th century protest against papal excess. These Borgia formulas, she said, tapping the 3D hologram of an arsenic-laced wine goblet rotating above the altar, contain precise isotopic ratios that selectively target cancer cells. A Japanese researcher flinched when the projection shifted to show the same compound's use in a 1945 suicide pill. History's darkest chapters were being rewritten in this sacred space where popes once conspired. As the debate turned to clinical applications, an elderly Swiss guard shuffled along the chapel's periphery. His arthritic fingers brushed a nearly invisible scratch on the marble floor, the exact spot where Emperor Charles V's coronation throne had stood in 1530, when the Medici Pope's first mortgaged salvation. Now pharmaceutical patents were the new indulgences, and this international team argued over who would profit from redeemed poisons. The hologram flickered as clouds passed over Rome. For one suspended moment, Michelangelo's hidden self-portrait seemed to stare directly at the 21st century scientists, his agonized expression mirroring their moral calculus. Then the projector stabilized. revealing the molecular structure that might soon grace chemotherapy vials worldwide. Its atomic bonds arranged in the exact bull's head pattern of the Borgia crest. Outside in the Vatican gardens, a gardener pruned the poison-tipped oleanders Alexander VI had planted 5 centuries earlier. The clippers hesitated at a new shoot, its flowers blooming an impossible shade of healing blue.